Cool. Yeah, so my name's Dustin Mihalik. I work here at Bazaarvoice. I'm a front-end developer. I work mostly on React projects. I work on some like customer-facing things. I work on some component libraries. And I like to say that I work on successful software because I've worked on some other successful projects too. But basically, I want to talk about projects that have some form of success, right? Like either you get a bunch more users, which means that you've got some scaling issues potentially, or something that you have a few users and they want to keep adding features to it, right? Like both of these are really hard problems that, if you're just doing like prototype, you don't really need to worry about it, like just write your prototype and you're done. If you're just writing, like some game development, game development, is anyone a game developer? No? This may not apply to them because like for the most part, like you write a game and you release it and then you patch it a couple times and then everybody forgets about it unless it's like an online game. But for most of us who are web developers or do like server-side software, like maintaining a bit of software for a long period of time and either having it grow or having a bunch of features added to it is a thing that we need to worry about. And so this isn't very React specific. There's some React mentions in here. I mentioned to Lyle that I was working on this presentation and he said he wanted to see it. And so everyone else gets to see it too. But before we talk about software, I want to talk about Austin. And so Austin is a successful city, right? So it started in the 1830s, and now there's millions of people here. It was at one point in time the fastest growing city in the nation. I don't know that it is right now, but at least for a few years, it was the fastest growing city in the nation. It started. This is a map from like 1870, and you can kind of see you can see the Capitol in the middle, and you can see Congress Street. But it started out very well planned, right? Like everything's at right angles. Everything makes sense except for a little bit around the Capitol. But since then we've kind of screwed it up. You can see the little bit that's good in the middle, but then everything else just kind of grew organically. But the little bit that was there, that was designed for horses and carts, because this was before cars, right? And so, as we got cars, as we got trains, as we got planes, they had to build an airport, and they had to move the airport, and they didn't rename the signs when they moved the airports. You got Airport Boulevard, but it's not at the airport, right? And then we've got, once a year, South by Southwest happens, a whole bunch of people show up. And you just don't want to go downtown, you don't want to deal with it, right? So I have a wonderful plan I want to let y'all in on. So I'm calling it Austin 2.0, and we're going to find another plot of land somewhere else, and we're going to take all the city resources, we're going to move them over there, and we're going to build a new Austin. And it's going to have a subway system, which would be awesome. It's going to have a train to the airport, so you don't have to drive to the airport and park in one of those things. Because why don't we have a train to the airport? And we'll build skyways between the buildings. You don't have to go outside in the heat, right? It's going to be cool, but it's going to take a couple of years. And until it's done, we're going to stop working on Austin 1.0. We're going to call it 1.0 Austin now. And we're going to stop working on that for a little bit. Maybe there'll be a few potholes. Maybe things won't go super well. But then there's going to be Austin 2.0. It's going to be awesome. It'll probably take us about 5 years, maybe. So obviously we don't do this type of thing with cities, right? There are people who live here, there are people who are using it, there are people who are happy here. We got to keep filling the potholes. And so, sometimes in Austin we tear down buildings. This was a building that they demolished. They called it the Intel shell or something because they actually never finished it. So it's like we tear down buildings, we build new buildings like this USB thumb drive building, which is downtown, which is awesome. Like sometimes we take the existing railroad system and we put a commuter car on it, which actually like it works pretty well, right? Like thousands of people ride it every day. We get those cars off the road. It would have been nice to have built like a real rail system, but we got like a half real rail system, and it's not too bad, right? So the analogy here is that we should think of software like a city, right? There are people there, and we kind of need to take care of them, and we can't necessarily just throw everything away and start new. Like sometimes you got to slowly improve it and not disrupt too many people. So, you know, a city's physical and software is not, so maybe that doesn't apply. So I want to talk about Netscape 4. Some people might have used Netscape 4. So this was the late 90s, and in the late 90s, Netscape was the web browser, right? Like on every system, the icon was Netscape. That's where you clicked to go and browse the web. And you know, Netscape 4 used the same render engine that they started with Netscape 1, which came from Mosaic. And so by the time they hit Netscape 4, like they had added JavaScript, like they invented JavaScript. They had added CSS. They had this thing called JSS, which was actually like their alternative to CSS, which was JavaScript styles. And they compiled CSS into JavaScript styles. It's like you couldn't turn off JavaScript because your styling had quit working. And this, like, Netscape was, to be an engineer on Netscape, it sucked. But as a web browser, like, it was okay. And basically what they decided is that, like, hey, we've added all this crap into here. It's gotten kind of hard to maintain, so we're going to rewrite it. And apparently, they said they were going to rewrite it in 6 months, or at least going to rewrite the renderer. So, I don't know, 6 years, 10 years of development, they were going to redo it in 6 months. They happened to do this at the time that Microsoft finally realized that the internet wasn't a fad, right? So Microsoft had Internet Explorer 2 or 3, and Netscape was like, hey, let's just pause on Netscape for a second while we rewrite it. So they started working on Netscape 5, and then they couldn't finish Netscape 5, and so eventually it was Netscape 6, and that was about 3 years later. And so during that time, everyone's like, hey, Netscape like is not progressing any, and you know, this Microsoft thing, like it's got ActiveX things and like all kinds of crazy stuff that Microsoft added to Internet Explorer, and so people kind of moved over there, and that's the browser wars. There were a lot of other things that went really weird, like they got acquired by AOL and then spun back out again, but 3 years without a browser release. They released patches like 4.7.9. I think they went up to like 4.9. Like they released a bunch of patches, but like no feature development happened. And so Netscape wasn't the first to do this. They weren't the first to like stop and learn this lesson. They definitely haven't been the last to learn this lesson. And for the most part, like everybody, like you can kind of think like, oh, it's kind of a bad idea to like take some code that mostly works and throw it away and start working on something new. But there's an appeal in it, right? You know, code is always easier to write than it is to read. Like it's always like when you're writing it, you kind of get into it, you figure it out, and you kind of just you crank it out, and it makes sense. And it makes sense for a couple days, and then you know, the weekend happens, and you come back from the weekend, and you can't remember what you were doing, right? And if that happens over a couple years, or like somebody else wrote it, and it's not quite how you would have done it, you know, you always think like, this thing isn't what I want. And so, you know, you convince yourself that if you spend X weeks or X months rewriting something, that like coming out the other side, your velocity is going to be way faster, right? It's like, oh, like I got all these features that people keep asking for and I can't do it. But if I take 6 weeks to rewrite this, then like the features are just going to write themselves coming out the other side. And unfortunately, that's almost never true. It's because everyone, like, usually I put a little asterisk next to things, like, it kind of depends, right? But this, like, everyone in this room is bad at estimation, right? Like, humans are bad at estimation. Even if you know, like, oh, I'm usually off by 20%, you always add 20%, like, you convince yourself, I don't know, it just never works. And you forget about the complexity, like, you can forget about, like, oh, you know, this code was difficult because like somebody ran it in like Safari private browsing mode, and you know they said that some APIs were on that are not on, and I don't know, it sucks. And so like it turns out the code that you're trying to replace was complicated for a reason, most of the time. So like this is the first thing. The second thing is like kind of as we mentioned with Netscape, like you lose forward momentum on the software that you have, and you lose forward momentum on the customers using it and collecting feedback. Like you kind of just stop paying attention to the existing bit of software. And I don't know, forward momentum is very important. Like I use VS Code, and like VS Code releases like every month or once a quarter. And they have like these crazy patch notes. Anyone use VS Code, you see these patch notes. They got like animated GIFs in it, it's awesome. Like I really like VS Code, and those patch notes are one of the reasons, because I'm like, they're always doing something to it. There's always forward momentum, and I look forward to the next release. And so if you kind of stop that forward momentum and you stop working on something, like I use the term software rot. Like obviously, the bits on your computer don't change. Like what you written to the hard drive 3 years ago is going to stay there. But there's a lot of like dependencies and tools that will potentially change over time, right? Like, you know, the version of Node you were using is way out of date, and you accidentally updated it, and you're not using NVM, like the thing stops building anymore. Or like, you know, there's even cases where like I've changed, like I used to use Bash and now I use Fish, and like some of my scripts don't work anymore. And like things, you get out of the habit of working on an old project, and you get out of the habit potentially of testing it and deploying it, and it becomes more dangerous to test and deploy, and then you're afraid that like, last time I did it, this thing broke and I don't want to do it again. And so like you start to worry about it. You're like, the longer that something sits and you haven't deployed it and tested it, the more that you worry about it. So there's this thing called second system syndrome, which actually exists outside of software. Like this is kind of a general engineering thing, which basically says that like the second thing that you build is like way more generic and usually ends up failing. And so like if I built chairs and I built like a 4-leg wooden chair, and like it worked pretty well, and then you know somebody says like, hey, I like chairs with wheels because I want to move around, and somebody says like, I got a bad back and I need lumbar support, and you know somebody else like wants arms and somebody doesn't. So my second chair, I'm gonna like build a little slot that the wheels fit in, so like sometimes it can have wheels and sometimes it can't. I'll put like an inflator to like inflate lumbar support or not, and you know I'll have arms on hinges or something, right? And so like it could be a chair that anyone could sit in and be happy with. But the problem is like nobody's gonna get happy with that chair because it's gonna be generic. But like, I don't know, the hinges will be flimsy, or like it will, if it doesn't have wheels on, it won't slide well or something like.
It's like the Homer Simpson car.
Yeah, it's the Homer Simpson car, right? Like you pile everything in so that it's going to be like the super thing. And for software, it's like, you say like, whenever I was using MySQL, like I had like, if I had to like add a new thing, I had to do a migration. And so you're like, I'm going to use this NoSQL thing, and like we'll just like use some sort of schemaless whatever. We'll just throw in whatever data comes from the API, and that's usually a bad decision too. And so like I don't know, this kind of thing actually goes in cycles, right? Like you do something and you learn what's bad about it, and then you do like the exact opposite thing and you learn what's bad about it, and then eventually like you kind of figure out where your thing is. And so if you're building deliverable software, like Netscape was, right? They kind of just stopped working on the old thing and started working on the new one, and it wasn't too bad. Like they probably had one or two people like patching the old one. But if you're building server software, or you're building something that like uses two different data, like you're moving from one database to another or something like that. For a period of time, you have to pay to run both of those databases, or you have to pay to run both of your servers, and you still have to handle outages, whatever. Like, depending on how long said rewrite takes, you've got two problems for a while, right? Okay, so I told you all the things that you shouldn't do and why you shouldn't do them. Probably I should tell you what you probably should do. And unfortunately, it's this word migration. And I say unfortunately because migration kind of has this like bad connotation in tech. Like it's a bad word that you don't want to say like, my team's doing a migration or whatever, right? But unfortunately, like always be migrating is kind of the answer to keeping software fresh and to keep it successful. Is picking the thing that is not ideal about your software, doing some sort of migration to move it to something that is more ideal, and then finishing that migration. That's the key to the whole thing, is finishing. So I want to give just this is a very generic, like how to do a migration. And it's just a blue software. It may or may not apply, but basically you want to take your bit of software, find a piece of it that is not optimal. You can't say the whole thing, like you have to choose a piece of it. And you want to figure out exactly where those edges are. Like I have the like fuzzy thing here, because obviously like it's not always going to be a square, and you might need to do some refactoring to round off that extra edge. But you want to find you want to be able to define something. So if this is like you're moving from jQuery to something else, or you're moving from MySQL to something else. Like you want a very well defined edge. Like you don't want something like you don't want this light blue to be sprinkled everywhere throughout your project. Like you need to kind of move it around so that you get something that has well defined edges. And ideally, you can kind of carve out those edges a little bit and make some sort of adapter. And this is where it really depends on the project that you're working on. But in the ideal case, you come up with some sort of interface, which is, hey, this is the interface from my software to this subsystem, and you can write tests around that adapter so that as you move, you can make sure that your new thing is good. You can run performance tests against said adapter, And the ideal case is you can write a little switch that lets you switch between the two things, right? That's great because it lets you, if you have like a feature flag, like it lets you send some traffic to the new thing, some traffic to the old thing. And once again, like maybe this doesn't work because maybe it's a database and you don't want to have to like sync data between the two or whatever. But like in the ideal case, you make a very nice clean interface, lets you switch between the two, lets you check performance. If something's wrong with one, you can always fall back to the other. And unfortunately, I mentioned finishing. Like this is the dangerous point in your project, right? Because you've got the new thing. It covers like 90% of the use cases, and it's way faster. But like some of this old thing that's like it does something really weird. So we'll just leave that there. Like if you do that, you end up with like super bumpy. Like you just keep adding to your code. And that's never a good thing. Like you have to eventually cut that old bit out, right? You have to eventually fill out the new thing, finish a migration, and then you go look for something new to replace. And if you do this enough times, you end up with all green software at that point, right? So that's super generic. It's not applicable to everyone. We'll talk a little bit about like some examples. So because this is a React meetup, I want to talk about React. So Facebook, develop React. Facebook's obviously a very complex application. And they came up with React to handle complex interactions. And they said React is gonna be awesome. We should use it everywhere. But they didn't just decide like they're going to use it everywhere right now. Like they picked messages, I believe. Maybe they picked something else. But like messages was a super complex thing, right? Like it's a little box that pops up that's like on every screen. It's the sidebar with all the people in it. It's the things at the top. So Facebook said like we're going to leave everything else as it is, and we're gonna use React for messages. We're gonna rewrite messages, or maybe they didn't have anything in messages before, but I think they rewrote messages.
I think it was the marketplace.
Yeah, so they have an ad they have an ad management thing that they rewrote as well. But anyway, the idea is pick something small, start with that, and then as you expand, and like. Instagram was something they wrote from scratch, and so they picked React for that as well. But definitely, think about where you can find little pieces. So React Rally 2017. So last year, there was Kara Quay that works at the NFL, and she gave a great talk about. So basically, like NFL has a whole bunch of different properties, right? Like they have a whole bunch of different websites that are all using different technologies, and they wanted to start using React, but obviously that didn't make a whole lot of sense. Or they didn't want to. It made a lot of sense, sorry, but like it would be difficult to like put React on like these WordPress blogs and whatever else they had, right? And so what they actually did, and if you're interested in this, like you should definitely go back and watch this. What they actually did is they made an iframe and used post message to basically inject React component, like make an iframe that was the React component that they care about. They made a little API into it. They used post message. And so that means that like they could give here, just put this little bit of JavaScript on your site and it would carve out the iframe and send in the data that it needed to with post message. And so like they were able to start a transition to React with, I think they did like their video player or something, right? Like they were able to start with like, we'll just do this iframe, and then they did something else after that, like the comments section or something like that. Like they ended up with a bunch of different iframes. Eventually the iframes will go away and it'll just be the React components that they wrote. but a transition into React is something that they did. So I want to talk about Facebook again, this time not React, this time PHP. So Facebook was originally written in PHP. They have millions of lines of PHP, and for those of you who've used PHP, the performance is not necessarily ideal on the PHP runtime. Security is not necessarily ideal. And so, once again, like Facebook had this decision, like, oh, do we rewrite our core platform? And they said no, and instead they wrote this thing called Hack, which is basically a PHP, alternative PHP runtime, which is actually a little bit crazy, right? Like instead of rewriting their software, they decided to rewrite PHP. But when you're Facebook scale, like potentially that makes more sense, right? Like there's potentially rewriting the PHP runtime was easier for them than rewriting the millions of lines of PHP code that they had. It was a decision they made. So I want to loop back around and talk about Firefox. So started with Netscape, which then became Mozilla, which eventually released Firefox. And actually, so the rendering engine that they wrote for Netscape 6, which is the thing that they spent 3 years rewriting, was a rendering engine that was in Firefox until very recently. So the Gecko engine was like 20 years old. And so basically over the last few years, they've been slowly replacing pieces of that rendering engine with new pieces that are written in Rust and a few other things. And so this is Lynn Clark's animation that she did. She was here, about a year ago. So you might recognize it. But she's got a really great blog post about like all the bits of the rendering engine and how they've slowly been replacing it. And Jen Simmons described it as replacing the jet engine while the jet's still flying, which is why there's the jet engine analogy here. But like that's kind of like they learned their lesson. They've been slowly replacing bits of Firefox, which is why it's gotten considerably better recently, because they're not running on the 20-year-old engine anymore. But there, like I said, there's a good blog post. So the overall goal, to take it back to the city analogy again, this was like I love SimCity. So basically, to take it back to the city analogy again, like I want to think about the software life cycle a little bit like a city, right? Like you got to go out and fix the potholes. Occasionally, you have to tear out a new building and replace it. But you should also be thankful for the buildings that you are tearing out, right? So that's the other thing, and I didn't really mention it, but so like the non-optimal bit that we were replacing before, it's not optimal for the shape of the city today, right? Like the roads that were built for horses are not necessarily good for cars, and the roads that are built for cars, landed airplanes or whatever, trains. But like if there's a bit of software that, because of scaling reasons or because of features, like you have to tear out and replace, it's probably because it was well designed for whatever scale. It was not over-engineered, let's say, right? Like if something works for 1,000 people but doesn't work for 10,000 people, then probably it was well designed for the number of people that you had at the time. So be thankful that it got you to where you are, and then figure out what to keep going. Overall, like you just want to keep your citizens happy and keep paying the taxes, right? So there's a few things, like a couple resources. The Netscape 4 thing is actually, so Joel Spolsky is Joel at Software. He's now like the CEO of No.
Fog Creek, but I don't
Yeah,
know what it's
but
called anymore.
Stack Overflow. And Trello probably. So he had a blog that where he talks about, so he calls it things you should never do, and talks about Netscape stuff and a few other things. So it's a good resource. Like that's a resource from like 2000, 2001. If you like old things. So this Will Larson works at Stripe. He's a engineering manager there. If you are an engineering manager and like these types of topics, you should read his blog because like everything that he's got is really good. And so there's the React Rally talk I mentioned, and then the Firefox quantum stuff. Lynn Clark is the one with the good article, cool drawings and stuff. That's it. Oh, sorry.